The first time I realized my family could forget me without blinking, I was 9 years old and standing alone on a stage with a cheap medal hanging around my neck. My teacher had squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "They'll be here soon, sweetheart." But we both knew she was lying to make the moment softer. The auditorium emptied, the lights dimmed, and I sat on the edge of the stage, feet dangling, rehearsing polite excuses I would give on their behalf. Traffic, confusion, overlapping obligations, as if defending the people whose absence was already shaping me. That night, I washed the medal in the sink because something in me assumed it wasn't clean enough to be displayed, certainly not important enough to take up space in our home. Years later, I learned that being forgotten is not always loud. It isn't screaming or slamming doors or dramatic exits. Sometimes neglect is quiet, polite, routine. Sometimes the cruelty is in the ease of it. Growing up in our Austin house felt like living backstage to someone else's performance. My sister, Vivian, was the born protagonist. Loud, charismatic, endlessly dramatic. She could stub her toe and summon a crowd with her moans. Brandon, my older brother, was a gravitational force. Athlete, class clown, resident trouble magnet. He didn't just take space, he absorbed it. And my mother, Marcia, adored the spectacle of them both. The loudness, the bright colors, the need. She fed on their attention like a performer feeds on applause. My father, David, liked order, predictability, and harmony. So he followed her lead, choosing the path of least resistance, which almost always required walking around me. I wasn't fragile, shy, or difficult. I was simply quiet. And quiet children don't disrupt parental routines. Quiet children don't demand attention. Quiet children become self-cleaning rooms, maintenance-free, low investment, invisible until needed. By middle school, I had learned to thrive in my own shadows. I packed my own lunches, did my own laundry, filled out my own permission slips. I learned early that the fastest way to disappointment was assuming someone would show up for me. So I didn't invite. I didn't ask. I didn't expect. And when I accomplished something, honor roll, science fair ribbons, robotics competitions, I tucked my certificates into a folder beneath my bed like contraband joy. Not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't bear watching those papers be received with bored indifference, or worse, defensive guilt. Whenever I tried to share something I was excited about, my family reacted like they'd been accused. "We're proud of you, sweetheart," my mother would say, looking at her phone. "But you know we're busy. You can't expect us to be everywhere." My father would nod along, adding something vague about time management, though he never managed his time for me. People assume abandonment is obvious, literal absence, blatant disregard, but the subtler version, the kind that etches itself into bone, sounds like, "We love you, but not when it's inconvenient. We love you, but not publicly. We love you, but not loudly." By the time I graduated high school, I had become a master of disappearance. When my name was called and I walked the stage, my family arrived late, smiling, waving, apologizing loudly in the aisle, as if their inconvenience deserved applause. I smiled back because I had been trained to translate humiliation into grace. But college changed the architecture of my life. Stanford wasn't a dream. I earned it through sweat, isolation, and the kind of stubbornness no one bothered to nurture in me. When I arrived, something shifted, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, silently, the way a tree grows beneath the soil before anyone sees branches. Professors saw me. Classmates remembered my name. Research partners asked for my ideas. For the first time in my life, I was witnessed. And yet I still flew home for holidays, still chased approval from people who weren't built to give it. I sent links to live streams of my presentations, no one clicked. I forwarded conference flyers, no one asked a single question. When I published my first academic paper, my mother said, "That's nice, honey, but Vivian just got promoted at work. We're doing a family dinner Saturday. Can you fly out for that?" I stopped responding to texts halfway through typing. The final fracture wasn't explosive, it was mundane. 3 months before my PhD defense, I sat at the kitchen table during a holiday visit, explaining the importance of my dissertation and the date of my defense for the 5th time. My family nodded, distracted. Brandon scrolled on his phone. My mother cracked crab legs, loudly interrupting me mid-sentence. My father said, "We'll try our best," without asking a single clarifying question. A week later, Brandon announced a massive barbecue scheduled for the same day. My mother said she'd help cook. My father talked about setting up tables. Vivian promised to bring Jell-O shots. When I reminded them about my dissertation, they blinked with blank discomfort, already annoyed that I had interrupted their excitement. "If you need us there, just tell us," Vivian said, "but don't guilt us into it." Guilt? I'd swallowed silence so long it calcified. The day of my defense, I walked into the lecture hall wearing the Navy suit I'd saved 6 months to buy. My classmates had families cheering for them, loud, proud, emotional. Mine had turned the grill on at noon. My advisor whispered, "Anyone coming?" I smiled, the smile of someone who has already lost so much it doesn't sting anymore. "No," I said, "but I'm here." I defended my dissertation flawlessly. I fielded questions with precision, I shook hands with colleagues and accepted congratulations from strangers. And afterward, when I walked alone to my car, wearing the title Dr. Evelyn Carter, the emptiness was so clean it almost felt holy. That night, I opened my laptop, downloaded legal name change forms, and began to dismantle a life built on being optional. Not out of spite, but because I finally understood something simple and devastating. People don't forget what matters to them. They just didn't forget me. They just didn't care.
There's a strange quiet that follows a massive achievement when no one witnesses it but you. It isn't pride. It isn't joy. It's a hollow kind of clarity, like walking into an empty cathedral and realizing the echo you hear is only your own voice coming back to you. After I became Dr. Evelyn Carter, I expected something inside me to ignite. Triumph, relief, gratitude, but what I felt instead was a muted exhale. A confirmation of a truth that had been aging inside me for decades. I could do everything right, excel beyond measure, and still be invisible to the people I had been taught to love first. That night, I sat at my desk and filled out paperwork with a precision I reserved for scientific experiments. Legal forms, social security requests, credit card updates, forwarding addresses, academic website revisions. The name I typed, Evelyn Morrison, felt foreign and familiar all at once. Morrison had belonged to my great-aunt Ruth, the only person who ever treated my existence as a privilege, not an obligation. She taught me early that attention is not love, noise is not devotion, and presence is a choice. When she hugged you, she did it with both arms, as if securing pieces of you the world might try to loosen. I didn't want to erase the girl she helped cultivate. I wanted to carry her forward with a name that honored survival instead of silence. When I hit submit, there was no ceremonial music, no applause, just a confirmation email and a soft hum from my laptop fan. It felt anticlimactic, and yet I understood immediately that anticlimax is how transformations occur. They don't come with fireworks. They come with small, decisive signatures. The next morning, I packed everything I owned into 4 cardboard boxes and 3 suitcases. My entire life distilled into items that could fit in the back of a borrowed truck. I didn't leave a note, not because I wanted to be mysterious, but because I had nothing left to explain. Leaving required no justification. Staying would have. I moved to Portland alone, driving 2 days straight, watching landscapes change the way I wished my family would. Trees got taller, skies colder, people quieter. When I crossed into Oregon, the GPS voice said, "Welcome," and I laughed, a short, strange laugh that sounded rusty, like a door opening after years of being sealed shut. My new apartment was small, simple, clean. The kind of place where nothing expected anything from me. No childhood photos on the walls, no cluttered hallways, no emotional residue lingering in corners. I set up my space with an efficiency that bordered on ritual. Desk by the window, plants on the sill, books stacked neatly the way I wished someone had stacked their attention toward me. When I finished, I sat on the floor with a grocery store sandwich and ate slowly, tasting every bite like it was a lesson. Even hunger felt different when you fed yourself without apology. Work came next. The consulting firm hired me for my research. Not my name, not my family, not my ability to make noise, just my mind. My first meeting, they asked what I thought. Not whether I had notes from someone else, not whether I could summarize another person's genius. They wanted my opinions, my voice, my interpretation. I wasn't prepared for how disorienting it was to be taken seriously without having to justify why. My mother's voice was the first to cut through the chapel's low hum, and it screeped across the room with that familiar blend of shock and accusation. "Evelyn, what is this?" She held the memorial program between her fingers like it had betrayed her personally. She didn't say, "You're here," or "I'm glad you came," or even, "Thank you for honoring your aunt." No, her instinct was to demand an explanation, like the name I chose was an act of violence against her, like my absence was a melodrama staged to inconvenience her routine. I kept my voice calm, my expression controlled, because years of silence had taught me how to absorb emotional debris without flinching. "It's my name," I said, legally. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she was scrolling through acceptable responses and finding none that let her remain the victim. Vivian appeared at her shoulder, face freshly made up like grief with a costume she'd prepared for. "You changed your name without telling us?" she hissed, half whisper, half judgment. The audacity of being surprised by the consequences of a decade of neglect would have been funny if it weren't exhausting. I smiled, not kindly, but quietly. "I didn't think you'd notice." That landed hard. Vivian's face pinched, and I realized she wasn't offended because the statement was untrue. She was offended because it was accurate. Brandon walked in, wearing sunglasses indoors like he was the main character at a rap star's funeral. He slapped me on the back, too loud, too familiar, too late. "Where the hell you been, sis? Ma's been losing her mind," as if my existence had been a hobby she misplaced. "I've been living my life," I said simply. He snorted, not cruelly, just dismissively. "Damn, girl, you could have told somebody before you ghosted the entire family." I stared at him, wondering if people who are used to being centered ever realize they interpret other people's boundaries as personal attacks. "I did," I replied, "for 26 years. Their confusion tasted familiar. It was the same look people give when a bridge collapses and they can't imagine how neglect could turn into disaster. "You really gonna make a scene at a funeral?" Vivian asked, voice dripping theatrics. She was the kind of person who believed conflict only counted when it was loud. I let my eyes drift toward my aunt's portrait. Soft smile, bright eyes, dignity that never needed applause. "I'm not making a scene," I said. "I'm telling the truth. If that feels dramatic, maybe examine why." Before they could respond, the pastor called everyone to be seated. People shuffled with polite reverence, whispering condolences, hugging distant cousins, performing community on command. I took a seat alone in the second row, leaving the front pew to a family that had never seen Ruth as anything more than an elderly woman to be visited on obligatory holidays. Ruth had been the only person who ever sat with me without asking what I could offer. When I was 12 and won a statewide science competition, she drove 3 hours to attend because my parents couldn't find a sitter. When I placed second in a national research contest in college, she mailed me a handwritten letter that said, "Do not become small to make others comfortable. Shrinking is a slow death." I wasn't shrinking anymore.
The service was gentle, elegant, unpretentious, exactly the way she lived. And yet, as the pastor spoke about kindness, authenticity, choosing love over performance, I felt my mother's eyes burning holes into me, not with grief, but with agitation. I could almost hear her thoughts. How dare you change your name? How dare you move away? How dare you rewrite the narrative where we aren't heroes? After the service, I stepped outside to breathe. The Texas heat pressed against my skin like a memory, persistent, suffocating, familiar. I found myself staring at the parking lot, forecasting escape routes. Trauma makes analysts of us all. The chapel doors opened and my father approached with that half-rehearsed smile he reserved for awkward situations. "We're worried about you," he said. A sentence so absurd it almost made me laugh. "You're worried because I left, not because I was alone." He stiffened, defensiveness tightening his jaw. "That's not fair." I nodded, slowly. Neither was being invisible. His silence wasn't reflective, it was offended. "You could have told us you were struggling." And I felt anger rise, not hot, but cold, precise. I wasn't struggling. I was succeeding. You just weren't there to see it. He blinked, like the idea of success without an audience was incomprehensible to him. Vivian emerged next, arms folded dramatically, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "So what? You just changed your name, moved states, blocked everyone, and didn't think that was extreme?" I took a breath, steady, grounded. I didn't block anyone. I disconnected access. There's a difference. Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" she demanded. I looked at her, not with resentment, but with the sharp, sad clarity of someone who has spent years measuring affection in ounces while others spilled gallons without thinking. "I could have, because you didn't forget anything," I said softly. The air shifted. Something invisible cracked, not between us, but within them. Denial requires ignorance. Honesty requires surrender. My mother walked out then, clutching her purse like a shield. "I don't understand why you're punishing us." The words were familiar, weaponized fragility. "I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself." She shook her head, dismissing truth like it was noise. "We're your family." And there it was, the ultimate entitlement. Not love, not accountability, ownership. "No," I said calmly. "You're people I grew up with. Family is something different." My mother's eyes glistened, not with grief, but with pride wounded beyond recognition. "You're being selfish," she whispered. I smiled then, genuinely, gently. "For the first time in my life, yes." She opened her mouth ready to perform outrage, but something unexpected happened. My aunt's best friend, a petite woman with silver braids and clear eyes, stepped forward. She touched my arm and said, "Ruth would be proud. She always wanted you to live big." The conversation stopped. Silence swallowed the porch, not because of conflict, but because truth had been witnessed by someone who mattered. I hugged her, and she held me like Ruth used to, two arms full present. When I pulled back, she whispered, "Go. Don't get trapped in their noise." I nodded, and for the first time in that city, I walked away without waiting for someone to follow or call or apologize. No one did. When I reached my rental car, I sat in the driver's seat without turning the engine on. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the shock of letting go. People talk about leaving like it's brave, dramatic, cinematic. They forget the cost. Leaving requires you to mourn the life you wished existed. I didn't cry. Not because I was numb, but because grief had already passed through me like weather, leaving clarity behind. I drove back to the airport, boarded the plane to Portland, and exhaled a lifetime of breath I had been holding. When I unlocked my apartment door, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Andre brought soup the next day. He didn't ask what happened. He just sat on my floor, ate quietly, and let the room fill with uncomplicated presence. At one point he said, "You look lighter." And I realized, startled, that I was. For the first time in my life, silence wasn't punishment. It was peace. I had not escaped my past. I had outgrown it. And the world, for once, made room.
The weeks after the funeral unfolded with a strange mixture of heaviness and spaciousness, like the aftermath of a storm that had torn everything apart but left behind a sky so wide it felt unfamiliar. I moved through my days with a new kind of lightness, not euphoric, not triumphant, but steady, clean, deliberate. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the invisible weight of anticipation, that constant tug-of-war between hope and resignation. I no longer waited for a text that wouldn't come, for a gesture that wouldn't arrive, for someone to finally recognize what had always been there. I didn't tell anyone at work what happened, not out of secrecy, but because some grief doesn't need to be shared. It just needs to be lived through. And besides, grief wasn't the headline. Freedom was. There is a quiet liberation in realizing you are no longer obligated to explain the choices that protect you. For years, I had tried to translate my pain into language my family could understand, thinking maybe there was a combination of words that could unlock comprehension. But some people are not fluent in empathy. They only understand loss when something they need disappears. Work became a grounding rhythm. I woke early, biked through the cool Portland mornings, drank coffee that actually tasted like something, and spent hours immersed in problems that mattered. Climate models, pollution mitigation, community impact reports. My brain was needed, valued, sought. Not for decoration, not for comparison, not as a proxy for someone else's pride, but for itself. Andre and I fell into a routine that was casual, soft, and most importantly, mutual. Wednesday lunches, Friday evening walks, Sunday morning farmers markets. He never tried to define it. Neither did I. We existed in that rare space where affection didn't require performance. He'd show up at my door with groceries and a joke, and I'd open it with sleepy eyes and appreciation. He made presence feel simple, not conditional. He listened without assuming solutions, spoke without demanding attention, and laughed without performing charm. One night, after a long project review, we sat in the office kitchen eating microwave dumplings from a paper tray. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a dull glow. He looked at me, studying my face for longer than casual friendship permits, and said, "You look like someone who built a life from scratch." I blinked, surprised not by his observation, but by how gently he offered it, without probing, without expectation. "I did," I said quietly. "I had to." He nodded, took another bite, and replied, "Most people inherit identity. Some people construct it. There's a difference." I let that sit between us, not because it hurt, but because it echoed something I had never said out loud. I wasn't escaping my past. I was designing a future. Later that week, I received a phone call from an unknown Austin number. I didn't answer. Not out of fear, but because closure does not require conversation. My voicemail filled with chaotic messages over the next few days, my mother's clipped desperation, Vivian's performative sorrow, Brandon's frustrated indignation. They all said a version of the same thing. "We love you." But the love they referenced wasn't about me. It was about access, about possession, about the right to be forgiven without earning it. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I was done. There was a difference between holding a grudge and holding a boundary. One is weight, the other is structure. People who lack accountability conflate the two because they experience limitations as punishment. They treat your not availability as cruelty because they have never interrogated the harm of their inconsistency. I found myself reflecting on this during a community meeting we hosted on environmental justice.
I stood at the front of a room full of strangers, explaining ecological systems and social responsibility, when a young student raised her hand and asked, "Why are communities of color always expected to adapt instead of being supported?" The room fell silent. Her question wasn't about water quality or pollution, it was about power. I thought of my childhood where adaptation was my only currency, where silence was survival, where invisibility was both burden and strategy. We adapt because we have to, but we should never forget that adaptation is not the same as acceptance. Survival isn't gratitude. Endurance isn't consent. Systems that depend on our resilience are not compassionate. They are exploitative. The student nodded, eyes sharp with recognition, and in that moment, I realized something simple but transformative. I had built a life where my voice mattered, not because it was loud, but because it was heard. After the meeting, a group gathered for coffee, and I ended up sitting with a woman named Priya, an engineer with a sharp mind and a laugh that sounded like she trusted joy. She asked about my work, my move, my transition. Not intrusive, just curious. I didn't offer the whole story, but I said enough. I left a version of myself behind. She smiled, knowingly. The version built for survival? Yes. And what did you replace her with? I thought for a long moment. Someone who is not waiting anymore. That night, I walked home in a gentle drizzle, the streetlights smudged gold through raindrops. My phone buzzed again, another Austin number. I blocked it. No rage, no fear, no guilt, just action. The next morning, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from my mother, short, stiff handwriting, formal, urgent undertone. "We are your family. You don't get to erase us." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. I wrote nothing back. I didn't erase them. I simply stopped centering them. Identity, I realized, wasn't a reclamation project. It was architecture, and the foundation mattered more than the name printed on the mailbox. One Saturday, Andre came over with groceries, arms full of produce and pastries. He dropped everything on my counter, looked at me, and said, "You okay? You've been quiet." "I've been thinking." "About them?" "No, about me." He smiled, the kind that doesn't need context. "Good." We ate breakfast on the floor, legs folded, plates balanced on knees. Sunlight spilled across the carpet, and something inside me settled, not with finality, but with possibility. Healing wasn't loud. It was ordinary, domestic, human. Years ago, silence was the cage they built around me. Now, silence was the space I built around myself. Not empty, not abandoned, not lonely. Open. And finally, mine.
There's a moment in every reconstruction where the past tries to bargain its way back into relevance, not with apologies, not with accountability, but with urgency disguised as affection. That moment arrived 2 months after the funeral, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when my office phone rang with an unfamiliar Oregon number that turned out to be a forwarded call from Austin. When I answered, the receptionist said, "There's a woman here insisting she's your mother. She's asking for your work address." I felt my body go cold in that specific way where instincts process danger faster than intellect. I took a slow breath and said, "Please don't give out any information. Tell her you'll have me call her." The receptionist paused. "She's upset. Should I call security?" I almost laughed. Not because it was amusing, but because it was surreal that it took my absence for anyone to consider protecting me. "No," I replied. "Just direct her to email. If she says anything concerning, contact HR." When I hung up, I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't even get frustrated. I just sat there, staring at my computer screen. understanding that my family wasn't worried about me. They were worried about proximity, access, control. They had built entire routines around the assumption that no matter how much they overlooked me, I would always remain available, quiet, reliable, orbiting around their gravitational center even when they didn't acknowledge the pull. My disappearance wasn't abandonment, it was mutiny. Later that day, I went for a walk along the waterfront to unclench the tension trapped in my chest. Portland's winter was gentler compared to Texas. Cool, damp, contemplative. I walked the trail with my hands in my pockets, breathing in the soft smell of rain and pine, feeling my heart beat at a pace that finally matched my life. Freedom has a pulse. You can hear it if you listen long enough. Andre called as I reached a bridge. "Hey, you okay? You missed the meeting." I told him what happened. Just the facts. Not the history, not the layers, not the hurt. He didn't jump to solutions or frustration. He just said, "Do you feel safe?" That question hit me harder than anything my family ever said, because it assumed my safety mattered. I exhaled. "I do now." He paused. "You want me to come over?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want him there, but because I was learning that needing someone didn't automatically equal weakness. "Yes," I said softly. "Come over." He arrived with Thai food, warm soup, and that rare kind of emotional stillness that doesn't demand attention. We ate on my couch with our legs up, watching a terrible documentary about invasive species. At one point, he looked at me, spoon paused midair. "You don't have to talk about anything until you want to. Just know I can handle the weight." And I realized then how conditioned I was to ration out my emotional truth, handing it in teaspoons to people who never bothered noticing it. The next day, I received an email from my mother with the subject line, "You can't run forever." I didn't open it, not because I couldn't handle what it said, but because I already knew the script. The Carter family was built on narratives where I was either fragile, overly sensitive, or ungrateful. They never considered that leaving wasn't abandoning them, it was choosing me. The irony was, while they worried, I was busy thriving. My project at work gained traction, earning praise from senior leadership. I presented findings to community partners who actually listened, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked me afterwards. People approached me after meetings wanting to collaborate, not compare. I had become visible, but not in a spotlight that felt interrogative. Visible in a way that felt like belonging. One night after a community workshop, Priya invited a group of us to a bar downtown. Industrial lights, mismatched furniture, microbrews with playful names. I wasn't a bar person, but I went because connection is built in small experiments. Andre was there too, leaning against the counter, wearing that effortless calm that made other people feel steadier just standing nearby. When he saw me walk in, his face softened in a way that wasn't theatrical, it was instinct. We sat in a circle, laughing about workplace absurdities, sharing personal anecdotes without judgment. At some point, Priya turned to me and said, "You're so grounded. Were you always like this?" The table fell quiet, eyes shifting towards me, waiting for something witty or self-deprecating. But I answered honestly, "No, I learned to be small so other people wouldn't feel challenged. I'm undoing that." Andre's eyes met mine, soft, steady, not pitying. He said, "It fits you, the unsmall version." I smiled, because I felt it too. Not confidence, clarity. A week later, my mother called from another number. This time I answered. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted closure on my terms. Her voice was sharp, tense, already defensive. "You can't just disappear from family. It's wrong." I let her speak without interrupting, because I knew interruption wouldn't change her script. When she paused long enough for breath, I said, "Mom, I didn't disappear.
I stopped participating in a relationship where I felt unseen. She exhaled strongly. You always exaggerate. We did our best. I took a slow breath, feeling every year of silence, every overlooked milestone, every dismissed celebration rising in my throat. I said, your best was rarely present. I stopped waiting for it. She didn't apologize. She didn't reflect. She just said the line that defined every relationship built on entitlement. Family doesn't do that. And I responded with a sentence that felt like a door closing, without hostility. Family doesn't leave each other alone in their joy. Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. Then she whispered, almost small, you changed so much. I exhaled. No, Mom. I just stopped apologizing for existing. She hung up before I could say goodbye. I stood in my kitchen afterwards, hands resting on the counter, feeling something shift. Not a release, not catharsis, but a recalibration. There are conversations that don't resolve wounds. They simply affirm that healing must happen elsewhere. Later that night, Andre texted, "Want company?" I typed back, "No, I'm good." And for the first time, that wasn't a performance of independence. It was truth. I went to bed early, window cracked, Portland rain tapping against the sill like gentle punctuation. I slept deeply, peacefully, without checking my phone for messages I no longer needed. People think rebirth is a loud declaration, but sometimes it's a quiet night, alone, without apology. The kind where you wake up and realize, not only did you survive, you finally arrived.
I didn't expect the feeling of stability to be terrifying. People don't warn you about that part. How peace can feel like a foreign country when you've spent your whole life building emotional shelters for storms that never stopped arriving. There were mornings I woke up before sunrise, heart racing for no reason, scanning my apartment like I was still living in someone else's house, waiting for a door to slam, a voice to bark orders, or a crisis to reroute the day. Nothing happened. Just silence. Just calm. Just me. And the absence of chaos felt so unfamiliar that my body mistook it for danger. Therapy health. Not in grand revelations or cinematic breakthroughs, but in small, grounding questions. My therapist, a woman with soft eyes and a sharp intellect, once asked me, "What does safety feel like in your body?" I stared at her, blank. I had never defined safety beyond not being attacked. Safety to me had always been the absence of harm, not the presence of comfort. I wasn't used to measuring life by what soothed me. I was trained to measure it by what I survived. One Friday evening, I sat across from Andre at a vegetarian spot downtown, the kind of place where everything on the menu tasted like health food and the walls were covered in murals about sustainability. He was telling a story about his grandmother, funny, ridiculous, full of animated gestures, when I realized I was smiling without thinking about it. Not because I was performing, not because I was trying to make him comfortable, but because whatever he said actually made joy rise up in me. He paused mid-sentence, looked at me and said, "What?" "Nothing," I replied, embarrassed by the warmth in my voice. "You're smiling like something's happening." I shrugged. "Something is." He didn't pry. He just squeezed my hand gently, grounding me in the present without demanding confession. That moment felt more intimate than any grand gesture could have, because it wasn't about claiming me. It was about witnessing me. I'd never had that before. At work, I dove into a new project, an environmental impact analysis for a rural water system. I spent late nights reviewing data, writing proposals, and attending meetings where people actually appreciated competence instead of being threatened by it. My boss, a stern woman who wore sneakers with business suits, stopped by my desk after one presentation and said, "You communicate like someone who knows they're right." I told her, "I communicate like someone who was ignored too long." She stared at me for a moment and then nodded. That tracks. One afternoon, I received an email from Vivian with the subject line, "Important Family Update." I stared at it for a full minute, debating whether curiosity or peace deserved priority. Eventually, I opened it. "Mom isn't doing well. She's stressed about you. You should just come home and fix this. It's gone on long enough. We're family and family forgives." I didn't delete it. I studied it like a cultural artifact, a relic from a world where emotional responsibility was assigned by hierarchy, not behavior. I didn't reply. Not because I was punishing her, but because the message wasn't written to me. It was written to the version of me they remembered, the quiet girl who accepted crumbs and called it dinner. A week later, Brandon sent a text. "Mom had a panic attack. You happy now?" I stared at the screen. Not angry, just tired. Emotional blackmail is a tactic used by people who can't tolerate accountability. They can endure their own cruelty, but not the consequences of it. I blocked his number. Not because I lacked compassion, but because I refused to be a receptacle for someone else's avoidance. There were nights when the loneliness of healing felt enormous, not because I missed my family, but because absence is heavy, even when it's necessary. I'd stand on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights flicker, thinking about how grief doesn't only come from losing people, it comes from realizing they're not who you needed them to be. One night, Andre came over with a bottle of red wine and a playlist of old soul music. We sat on my living room floor talking about careers, childhoods, fears. At one point he said, "You're strong in a way most people don't understand. Not loud strong, structural strong." I blinked. "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "You don't bend to fit rooms. You redesign them." I wanted to kiss him then, not because I was in love, but because tenderness can be its own kind of truth. But I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to turn something steady into something complicated. He sensed it, leaned back and said, "We don't have to rush anything. I like the pace we're at." And I realized with a kind of startled gratitude that he wasn't trying to speed up intimacy or define it. He was letting it land where it landed. Meanwhile, my family escalated. Emails turned into calls. Calls turned into messages from unknown numbers. Then came the guilt-laced accusations. "You're breaking this family apart. You're selfish. You owe us a conversation." Here's what people who neglect you never understand. They don't lose you when you walk away. They lose you when you stop trying. And I had stopped trying. One Monday morning, I woke up, made tea, stood at my kitchen counter and realized I hadn't thought about my family in 3 full days. Not in anger, not in longing, not in calculation. 3 days without carrying their weight. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a series of quiet, cumulative victories. A night without loneliness. A day without checking old texts. A moment without shrinking. A morning without bracing for harm. I started keeping a list in my notebook titled "Things That Feel Like Proof." I wrote down, I told Andre no, and he stayed. I existed openly at work, and no one punished me.
I blocked my brother and my world didn't collapse. I laughed without apologizing for being loud. For years, silence was the space where I waited for permission. Now, silence was the space where I listened to myself. And every day, that voice grew steadier, louder, truer. Not loud for attention, loud for existence, loud for me.
The first real test of my new life wasn't a crisis. It was an invitation. In late spring, I received an email from a national environmental conference asking me to deliver a keynote on my research. It wasn't just a panel or a discussion. It was the opening address, the one that sets the tone, shapes the conversation, frames the work. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling that old reflexive doubt creep up. Am I enough? Do I belong here? Will people listen? But beneath those questions sat something quieter, sturdier, more mature. I have earned this. I said yes. Andre celebrated in his subtle, understated way by showing up at my apartment with a bottle of sparkling cider because I had sworn off alcohol for a month, and a card that simply read, "They chose you because you're remarkable." He didn't exaggerate, he didn't dramatize, he didn't make it about him, he just affirmed plainly without noise. I taped the card above my desk. Preparing for the keynote forced me to confront a part of myself I wasn't used to honoring, the version of me who was not just intelligent, but authoritative, not just hardworking, but visionary. For years, I had learned to edit my brilliance, to shrink the peaks, soften the edges, dim the light, because shining too brightly made other people uncomfortable. My family never said, "Be small," but they rewarded invisibility and punished ambition with silence. Now I was being asked to speak loudly. I spent nights drafting, rewriting, and recording myself, discovering that my voice, my literal voice, was richer than I remembered. I practiced in front of my bathroom mirror, watching my face transform as I allowed confidence to sit naturally on it. There was no arrogance in it, no performance, just clarity. The conference coincided with a stretch of heavy rain, the kind Portland specializes in, persistent, icy, and oddly comforting. The morning of the keynote, I stood backstage wearing a navy blazer, crisp white blouse, and black trousers. My hands were cold, not with fear, but with electricity. When they introduced me, I stepped forward with a steadiness that surprised me. I spoke about ecosystems, not just natural ones, but human ones, how environments adapt when threatened, how communities stretch, bend, and reshape themselves to survive external pressures, how resilience can be both brilliant and tragic. At the end, I said, without naming myself, we cannot keep teaching people to survive systems that refuse to change. Survival is not compassion. It is neglect disguised as admiration. The room was silent. Not awkwardly, but reverently. Then the applause rose, loud, sustained, unhesitant. Afterward, people lined up to talk to me, scientists, activists, students, city planners. Not one of them asked where I came from or who I belonged to. They asked about my work, my ideas, my perspective. They treated me as someone whose existence mattered beyond familial context. I left the conference center and stood in the rain for a long moment, letting it soak into my blazer, feeling a strange gratitude for the discomfort, for the cold, for the reminder that growth is not always warm. 2 days later, my mother called from a new number. I ignored it. Then she emailed, "Your cousin said you were on the news. Why didn't you tell us you were doing something important? We would have supported you." I sat at my desk, stunned, not by the claim, but by the audacity. Support had never been something they offered freely. It always had conditions, requirements, agendas. And the email wasn't an apology or reflection. It was irritation at being excluded from something prestigious. They wanted credit for a success they never nurtured. I didn't respond. 3 days later, Vivian sent a voice message. Mom's losing it. She's embarrassed. People are asking why you didn't post about your speech. You need to reach out and fix this before it gets worse. Fix this? Not heal. Not talk. Not rebuild. Fix. Childhood trained me to absorb responsibility for other people's emotions. Healing taught me that responsibility is not inheritance. I deleted the message. But their relentless escalation triggered something unexpected. Not fear, not guilt, but grief. Not for them, but for younger me. The girl who would have apologized, explained, begged, justified. The girl who believed that love meant service. I walked to the waterfront that evening, rain stinging my face, watching the river churn beneath streetlights. Portland's skyline glowed, soft, muted, tender in the dark. I leaned against the railing and let myself feel what I had been avoiding. Abandonment isn't just pain, it's identity theft. When the people who raised you refuse to see you, you learn to question your own visibility. Andre found me there because he always could read the weather of my silence. He didn't ask what happened, he just stood beside me, hands in his pockets, staring at the water. After a long stretch of quiet, he said, "You don't have to defend your choices to people who never defended you." I hadn't told him anything, and yet he knew everything. "I keep thinking if I explain, they'll understand," I whispered. He shook his head. Understanding isn't the issue. Capacity is. Some people just don't have the emotional range to witness someone's evolution when they benefited from their suppression. I swallowed hard because it was brutal and true. "They're scared," he continued, "not because they lost you, but because you proved you never needed them." I turned toward him, eyes burning, rain and tears indistinguishable. "Why does that hurt?" His voice softened. "Because you needed them, and they never showed up." We talked for hours about families, survival, the cost of becoming yourself. There was no romance in that moment, just honesty. Deep, unglamorous honesty. When I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote, "I am not obligated to return to the house that taught me to starve so they can pretend to feed me." A week later, I received a letter from Brandon, not angry this time, but panicked. "Mom says you're punishing us. She says she tried. Dad says you're being dramatic. Vivian says you're selfish. I think you're brainwashed. Just call someone before this gets worse." I stared at the words, realizing something profound. They still believed there was a version of me who existed to make their world easier. They still believed I was coming back. The truth they could not comprehend was simple. I didn't leave so they would chase me. I left because I finally stopped chasing them. And the most unsettling part for them was that my life didn't collapse without them. It expanded. Quietly, steadily, unapologetically, while they spiraled. For the first time, I understood. Freedom doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels like standing alone on a shoreline, watching the tide come in, realizing you don't have to drown to prove you're worth saving. The thing no one tells you about becoming someone new is that the ghosts don't disappear just because you do. They linger, not as voices, but as reflexes, muscle memories shaped by years of emotional labor. I thought distance would dismantle those reflexes, that leaving would erase the instincts, but trauma is not a failing memory. It is a rehearsed performance the body knows by heart.
I started noticing the old habits sneaking in on normal days and mundane moments. I'd rush through emails, apologizing for delays that didn't exist. I'd rewrite sentences to sound less competent, less assertive, less certain, afraid of being perceived as abrasive. I'd shrink in meetings, not because I lacked confidence, but because I wasn't used to taking up verbal space without guilt. Healing wasn't erasure. It was unlearning choreography rehearsed for decades. One night, after a long strategic planning session, I stayed late at the office, reorganizing data sets that didn't technically need to be reorganized. Andre walked in, jacket slung over his shoulder, eyes narrowed with amusement. "You know it's 9 p.m., right?" I didn't look up. "I know." He leaned against the doorframe. "Are you working late or hiding in here?" I closed my laptop and sighed. "Maybe both." He didn't push, but he did walk in, sit on the floor, and say, "Okay, let's hide together." We talked about everything except emotions. Favorite movies, the ridiculous coffee culture in Portland, the superior design of fountain sodas versus bottled, ordinary things, safe things, domestic softness in a sterile office. At one point, he told me, "You don't have to earn rest." I blinked, startled by how revolutionary that sounded. "I don't know how to rest without proving I deserve it." He nodded. "I know. That's why I'm telling you." I went home that night with an unfamiliar question echoing in my head. What does rest look like when it isn't a reward for suffering? A week passed without incident until an email from my father arrived. Short and utilitarian. "We need to talk. You're upsetting your mother. Call as soon as possible." No greeting, no context, no softness, just obligation framed as emergency. The old reflex stirred. Guilt, urgency, responsibility, but it didn't settle as easily as it used to. I read it twice and realized I wasn't obligated to respond immediately, or at all. The truth was, they didn't want conversation. They wanted compliance. I didn't reply. 2 days later, my supervisor, Elena, called me into her office. I braced myself for criticism, old reflex again, but instead she said, "We're restructuring leadership. I want you to oversee the new community outreach division." My brain scrambled through disbelief. "Why me?" She raised an eyebrow. "Because you're brilliant, you're organized, and you understand people. Also, no one else volunteered." I laughed, despite myself. That last part tracks. The promotion came with more responsibility, more visibility, and a salary that made my old life feel like a different era. I texted Andre, not to brag, but to share the moment with someone who valued me without transactional interest. He appeared at my door 30 minutes later, holding cheap champagne and cupcakes. "We're celebrating," he declared, "and we're not doing it humbly, so don't start with that 'I'm grateful but' nonsense." We ate cupcakes in my kitchen, frosting smeared, laughter unfiltered. Mid-bite, he said, "You're building something you weren't given." I swallowed. "What's that?" He gestured around the apartment, at the atmosphere, at me. "A life that fits." His words settled deep, not as praise, but recognition. Later that night, I received a message from Vivian. Not angry this time, not accusatory, but oddly vulnerable. "I don't know how to fix this without you telling me what to do." I sat on the edge of my bed and reread it a dozen times. For a moment, I almost replied, not because I owed it, but because old patterns still had muscle. Then I realized something essential. Clarity without accountability is manipulation disguised as progress. Wanting repair is not the same as doing repair. Wanting peace is not the same as earning peace. I put the phone down. The next morning, my mother called again. I didn't answer, but this time she left a voicemail that didn't sound performative. It sounded frantic, breathless, panicked. "I don't understand why you're punishing us. We're your family. We're supposed to stay together. We're supposed to forgive each other. I made mistakes, but you can't cut us out forever." Her voice cracked, not in remorse, but in fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing narrative, fear of being held accountable by someone who finally realized she deserved better. I didn't return the call. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. A mix of coworkers and neighbors, nothing fancy, wine, snacks, mismatched chairs. At one point, someone asked, "So, where's your family?" I paused, searching for a truthful answer that didn't require excavation. "Not here," I said simply. No one pressed for details. No one performed curiosity. They just nodded, like that answer was enough. Andre arrived late, carrying homemade guacamole in a ceramic bowl. He pulled me aside, smiling. "You look happy." I glanced around, at the laughter, the ease, the lack of emotional calculus. "I am," I said. "Mostly. Sometimes." He nodded. "That's more than most people get." As the night wound down, Andre helped me clean up, dishes clinking softly, music still playing low. At one point he said, "You're changing." I froze. The statement hit somewhere tender. Is that good or bad? He shook his head. "Neither. Just true." I swallowed. "What do you see?" He thought for a moment. "Someone who doesn't need to disappear to survive." I didn't have a response. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't recognize myself in those words. Not yet. But I wanted to. 2 weeks later, my mother sent another email. Not guilt this time, but plea. "Please come home, we're falling apart." I stared at the screen, feeling something shift. Not anger, not empathy, just clarity. They weren't falling apart because I left. They were falling apart because my absence revealed the cracks they couldn't ignore anymore. They wanted me to return so they could pretend those cracks didn't exist. I closed my laptop and went for a walk. A soft drizzle fell, the kind that made the city blur into watercolor. I stopped by the river, hands tucked into my coat, watching ducks glide through murky water. Portland didn't feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a foundation. A new thought arrived, startling in its gentleness. Maybe healing isn't about becoming unbreakable. Maybe it's about becoming unwilling to remain broken. On the walk back home, Andre texted, "Dinner?" I replied, "Yes, but let's order in. I'm tired." His answer, "Rest is allowed. I'm bringing takeout." I stepped inside my apartment, closed the door, and exhaled. Not because I was relieved, but because finally my life felt like something I didn't need permission to inhabit. Some nights survival is loud, but sometimes it's as simple as unlocking a door, turning on soft lights, and saying, "This is my home now, and I'm not leaving it behind to rescue people who never learned how to see me."
The next rupture didn't arrive with yelling or threats. It arrived with paperwork. On a quiet Tuesday morning, while I sat in my office reviewing a proposal about watershed restoration, I received a certified letter addressed to Dr. Evelyn Morrison, my legal name, my new name, which meant whoever sent it either respected it or investigated it. I signed for the envelope with a shaky hand, carried it back to my desk, and stared at it for a full minute before opening it. It wasn't from a colleague or agency. It was from an attorney in Austin. Inside was a letter from my mother's lawyer stating that she was filing a petition to have me declared mentally unwell and temporarily incapacitated, granting my parents legal access to my finances and personal affairs until I resolved my crisis. The justification, my sudden disappearance and identity change, was evidence of an emotional breakdown. They wanted to intervene for my safety. I laughed, not a joyful laugh, a sharp, involuntary bark, the kind that lives somewhere between disbelief and disgust. There were 2 exhibits attached, emails I had never written, texts I had never sent, fabricated evidence of distress. And at the bottom of the last page, in my mother's handwriting, "We just want our daughter back." I sat there for a long time, reading, rereading, watching shock metabolize into something steadier, colder, older, recognition. People talk about gaslighting like it's subtle psychological manipulation, but sometimes it's brazen, bureaucratic, weaponized through legal systems designed to protect people who have the resources to exploit them. I wasn't scared. I was insulted.
I closed the file, took a deep breath, and marched straight into my supervisor's office. Elena, unbothered by authority and allergic to drama, looked up from her laptop. "Problem?" I said flatly, like I was reciting weather data. Her eyes sharpened. "Do you need legal support?" Her immediate response wasn't curiosity or judgment. It was protection. That startled me more than the letter. I nodded. "Yes." She didn't hesitate. She dialed HR, scheduled a meeting, and told me, "Take the rest of the day, handle what you need to handle. We'll back you." Simple. Steady. No questions asked. I walked out of work into a cold drizzle, clutching the envelope like a relic of an older life. I wasn't alone, but the loneliness of being misrepresented by the people who raised you is a flavor of pain no one prepares you for. It's not grief, it's betrayal. The kind that comes with signatures, notarization, and legal threats. I called Andre. He answered on the first ring. "What's wrong?" he asked, instinctive, tuned to the frequency of my silence. I told him everything, not edited, not minimized. The full, absurd, horrifying truth. He didn't rage or pity or lecture. He simply said, "I'm coming over." He arrived with files, snacks, and the calm presence of someone who refuses to be a spectator in your fear. We spread documents across my kitchen table, analyzing tone, strategy, intent. He pointed to one line. "Your family claims you're experiencing paranoid isolation, evidenced by your break in communication." He exhaled sharply. "They're weaponizing your boundaries." I nodded. "They're building a narrative where I'm unstable so they can force access." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "This isn't about concern. This is retaliation." We contacted an attorney recommended by HR, someone specializing in family law and privacy violations. When she heard the situation, she didn't soften it. She said, "Your family is attempting conservatorship. This is serious, but they don't have a case if you're functioning independently and can demonstrate capacity." She asked questions: employment status, housing stability, medical history, psychiatric care. I answered each calmly, truthfully, without fear. At the end, she said, "You're fine. They're overreaching. We'll shut this down quickly." Relief washed through me, not because I doubted my stability, but because I had spent my life trapped in a home where perception outweighed reality. Now reality had witnesses. A week later, we filed a formal response. The attorney drafted a cease and desist order warning my family that further harassment could result in legal consequences. The court date was set, and I requested to attend remotely. I didn't want to step foot in Austin. I didn't want to breathe their air, but I wasn't running.
2 nights before the hearing, I had dinner with Andre at a small Ethiopian restaurant. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting warm shadows. He ate quietly, studying me with that gentle attentiveness that felt like safety. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm angry," I admitted. "Not because they hurt me. I've been hurt before. but because they're rewriting the story to make themselves heroes. He nodded. Control doesn't disappear just because you walk away. It panics. I picked at my food, appetite eroded. They think I'm unstable. He shook his head. They think your independence is rebellion. They don't know how to interpret autonomy without pathologizing it. I swallowed. Do you think I'm cruel for cutting them out? His expression softened, not pity, but reverence. No, I think you finally realize that loyalty without reciprocity is self-harm. Silence settled between us, warm, heavy, true. The night before the hearing, I barely slept, not from fear of losing, but from dread of engaging. Part of healing is realizing that closure doesn't always come from conversations. Sometimes closure comes from refusing to entertain narratives designed to erase you. The morning of the hearing, I logged into the virtual courtroom, dressed professionally from the waist up, blazer crisp, hair pulled back, voice steady. My family appeared on the screen. My mother tearful, my father stiff, Vivian dramatic, Brandon irritated. Their lawyer argued concern, fear, family rights. My attorney argued evidence, stability, autonomy. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't wage war. I didn't weep. I didn't explain my history. I simply said, I am not missing. I am not unstable. I am not unsafe. I am choosing a life outside a system that refused to acknowledge my existence. That choice does not make me mentally unfit. It makes me free. The judge listened, and when she ruled, it was swift, clinical, devastating to them. Petition denied, immediate dismissal. Further attempts may result in sanctions. My mother gasped like tragedy had struck her personally. Vivian burst into theatrics. Brandon muttered a curse. My father stared with cold, quiet contempt. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, bone-deep tired, because legal victory doesn't erase emotional history. After the call ended, I closed my laptop, exhaled, and let reality settle. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Not their anger, not their narratives, not their desperation. They had spent years teaching me that independence was isolation. But now, distance wasn't exile. It was expansion. I sat on my couch, sunlight warming my legs, and wrote in my notebook, freedom isn't the absence of attachment. It's the absence of permission. Hours later, Andre showed up with groceries, placed them on the counter, and asked, how'd it go? I smiled, not triumphant, just grounded. They lost. He grinned. Of course they did. You're not someone people went against. I leaned against the counter, exhausted but steady. Why does victory feel so empty? He looked at me, eyes soft. Because you weren't fighting for power. You were fighting for peace. And for the first time in my life, I realized peace isn't loud. Peace isn't cinematic. Peace isn't applause. Peace is simply the moment you stop fighting to exist in places that require proof of life. I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop being hunted. And I had. After the hearing, there was this strange, eerie quiet, like the emotional equivalent of a power outage. Not relief, not celebration, just the sudden absence of noise that had been constant for so long it had become a soundtrack. I went back to work, answered emails, attended meetings, ate lunch, laughed at stupid office jokes, but there was a part of me still bracing for an aftershock. Trauma does that. Teaches you that every calm moment is a prelude to crisis. You don't trust rest. You interpret silence as forewarning. But no one called, no one texted, no one emailed. For 2 entire weeks, there was nothing. Then, as if waking from hibernation, my mother sent a message to my work email. Not legal, not formal, emotional in that familiar, manipulative tone that dressed itself as vulnerability but always smelled like performance. Her subject line was a single word: please. The body of the email read, "I don't know who you've become, but I don't recognize this version of you. You're so cold, so distant, so cruel. I raised you better than this. We were a family. I made mistakes, but we are supposed to forgive each other. You don't get to cut us out forever. We won't survive like this." I stared at the message, feeling nothing at first. No anger, no sadness, just a kind of muted disbelief. The idea that her survival was dependent on my emotional labor was a truth she stated without shame, as if my role had always been caretaker, emotional sponge, family glue. As if my absence created dysfunction, not revealed it. As if I was the axis on which their stability rested. I considered replying, not with venom, but with clarity. Then I remembered something my therapist said during a session. You cannot reason someone out of a story that protects them from accountability. So I didn't respond. Instead, I created a filter that forwarded all messages from her to a separate folder I named Archive of Unfinished Conversations, not as punishment, as preservation of my peace. Around that time, work became heavier, deadlines stacking, demands increasing, pressure mounting in ways that made my chest tighten during the day and my jaw ache at night. Leadership was exhilarating, but exhausting. People assumed competence was limitless. They mistook calm for capacity. I tried to keep up, but my body started sending signals. Headaches, insomnia, a persistent ache in my shoulders like I was carrying something invisible. One night, around 7 p.m., I was still at my desk, staring at spreadsheets that blurred into abstract shapes. Andre appeared at the doorway, leaning against the frame. "You're doing it again," he said softly. I rubbed my temples. Doing what? He walked in, sat next to me, and nudged my laptop closed. "Trying to earn your existence through exhaustion." I sighed. "There's too much to do." He shook his head. "There will always be too much to do. But if you work until you break, you're not proving strength. You're reenacting survival." I leaned back, eyes burning. "I don't know how to stop." He touched my hand in that steady, grounding way he had. "Then learn, slowly, imperfectly, with help." He made me pack up and took me to a late-night diner, the kind with sticky menus and vinyl booths and cheap coffee. We ordered pancakes at 10:30 p.m. and watched teenagers flirt awkwardly at the counter. For a moment, the world felt uncomplicated, soft, almost adolescent. We sat there, eating greasy food, talking about nothing important, and I realized how rare it was to feel safe in public spaces. Not invisible. Safe. A few days later, Priya invited me to a small gathering at her apartment. Board games, random snacks, and people sprawled across mismatched furniture laughing at dumb jokes. I arrived late, worn down, expecting to socialize politely and leave early. Instead, I stayed until midnight playing card games, losing every round, laughing so hard my stomach hurt. No one asked me to explain my absence. No one studied me for cracks. No one treated me like a project. I wasn't performing. I was belonging. As I walked home that night, the city quiet around me, I thought about the illusion of independence I had built. Leaving my family wasn't just an escape from them. It was an escape from a version of myself who believed the only safe identity was solitude. I had constructed walls to protect myself from abandonment, but those walls had also shielded me from connection. Healing wasn't isolation. Healing was discernment. Not everyone needed access, but some people deserved it. A week later, Andre and I sat on my balcony, legs stretched out, mugs of tea warming our hands. The city lights blinked below, scattered like stars that couldn't commit to the sky.
He looked at me with that slow, patient gaze I'd come to associate with truth. "You know you're allowed to be soft, right?" he said. I shrugged. Softness feels dangerous. Softness isn't the absence of strength, it's the absence of war. I didn't respond immediately. The words landed too deeply, unsettling familiar defenses. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Not of being alone, of being seen." He nodded. "Being seen means someone might stay, and someone might leave. But neither outcome defines your worth." Something inside me cracked. Not dramatically, not painfully, just enough to let air in. Days passed, work stabilized, life softened. I started sleeping better, eating better, laughing without analyzing tone. And for the first time, I felt present in my own body. Then on a random Sunday morning in late June, I received a call from a hospital in Austin. The nurse said, "Your mother listed you as your emergency contact. She's here following a stress-related cardiac event." My knees went weak. Not from grief, not from fear, but from the weight of a responsibility I didn't agree to, but inherited anyway. I asked if she was conscious. "Yes, stable. She keeps asking for you." I sat on my couch, phone warm against my ear, heart pounding. I didn't rush to book a flight. I didn't burst into tears. I didn't feel obligated. I just breathed, slow, steady, stunned by the complexity of the moment. Because in that instant, I realized healing does not erase history. It does not undo harm. It does not turn absence into indifference. Healing simply gives you the clarity to choose who you become in the face of someone else's collapse. I hung up, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. And for the first time in my life, I had no script, no reflex, no expectation. Just a question echoing through the quiet. What does compassion look like when it is not synonymous with self-sacrifice?
I didn't go to Texas immediately. That fact alone would have once felt monstrous, proof of heartlessness, evidence of a daughter gone feral. But now it just felt honest, real, human. Trauma twists choice into obligation. And I wasn't willing to abandon the hard-earned clarity I'd fought for just because the people who once neglected me were suddenly in crisis. I called the hospital back, asked for a doctor rather than a nurse. I wanted facts, not emotional theater. He was direct, efficient. It was a mild cardiac event, no permanent damage, elevated stress. She will be discharged in a few days with recommendations for lifestyle modification. His tone assured me of something I hadn't realized I feared. This wasn't a tragedy trying to drag me home. This wasn't my mother dying. This wasn't an emergency designed by the universe to guilt me back into servitude. This was an adult with health problems. Not a reckoning. Not a punishment. Not a cosmic command. The next call came from Vivian. She didn't sound angry this time. She sounded exhausted, shaken. "Mom keeps asking for you," she said, voice cracking. "She keeps saying, 'Where's Evelyn? Call Evelyn.' She's scared." I was silent for a moment. Not frozen, not confused, just processing the unfamiliar feeling of being requested instead of expected. "I'm glad she's okay," I said softly. Vivian exhaled shakily. "She misses you. We all do." I didn't respond. Silence, for once, wasn't a doorway. It was a mirror. She rushed to fill it. "Everything fell apart after you left. It's like you took the structure with you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was telling. They hadn't realized I'd been the scaffolding holding up a building no one cared to maintain. They hadn't realized that my compliance was the glue, my silence, the gravity, my self-neglect, the architecture. "Vivian," I said gently, "I didn't leave to punish you. I left because I was collapsing."
She inhaled sharply. We didn't know. You didn't say anything. That sentence, careless, defensive, wildly convenient, hit me with a sudden exhaustion. I said it. For years. Quietly. Softly. Carefully. But you weren't listening for quiet pain. You only responded to loud crisis. She went silent. That silence felt different, less combative, more reflective. Are you coming home? She asked finally. I didn't recognize my own voice when I said, I don't know if home exists for me there anymore. After the call, I sat in my living room, lights dimmed, the soft hum of the refrigerator underscoring the moment. I thought of my mother, her flaws, her selfishness, her blindness, but also her tenderness when I was very young, those fleeting moments when she brushed my hair before school, when she kissed my forehead absent-mindedly while cooking. I thought of how sometimes parents don't fail because they don't love you, but because their love is structured around themselves, not you. It wasn't hatred I felt toward her. It was grief. Clean. Unhurried. Almost gentle. A few days later, I flew to Austin not because they demanded it, but because I chose it. Not as a dutiful daughter returning home, but as an adult, visiting a familiar landscape that no longer owned her. The city felt the same, humid, sprawling, familiar in the way old wounds are familiar. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent fatigue. When I walked into my mother's room, she was propped up on pillows, pale but conscious, wearing an expression I'd never seen on her face before, vulnerability without bravado. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Evelyn, she whispered. Not Evelyn Carter. Not baby, not honey. Just my name. The name I chose. She reached for me instinctively, then hesitated, as if remembering that she no longer had the right. I sat beside the bed, not too close, not defensive. Just present. We didn't talk about accusations or court or betrayal or the way she tried to legalize control. We talked about weather, about food, about small human things. Her voice trembled when she said, You didn't come back angry. I shook my head. No. She swallowed. Why? I took a long breath. Because anger requires attachment. I'm not attached anymore. Her face crumpled, not from guilt, but from loss. Do you hate me? She whispered. I considered the question. The old version of me would have rushed to reassure, to soothe. The new version told the truth. I don't hate you. I just don't belong in the life you built around my silence. She cried. Not dramatically, not manipulatively, but with small, uneven breaths that sounded like surrender. She wiped her eyes clumsily, like someone who wasn't practiced in vulnerability. She's thought you'd forgive me because you're strong. You're the strong one. You always were. Something inside me tightened, not with pride, but with recognition. She had mistaken resilience for invincibility. She had mistaken endurance for requirement. She had mistaken silence for strength. I wasn't strong, I said softly. I was surviving. We sat in a long, unadorned quiet. The nurse came in, checked vitals, adjusted wires. My mother drifted into a medicated sleep, her breathing heavy, uneven. I watched her chest rise and fall and felt a complicated tenderness, love not erased, but evolved. I stayed a few days, not in the house I grew up in. I booked a hotel downtown where I could breathe, where no ghost had a key. Vivian took me out for coffee. Brandon apologized awkwardly, badly, but sincerely. My father pretended everything was fine because that was his emotional strategy. Denial as diplomacy. When I left Texas, there were no dramatic reconciliations, no hugs in the rain, no cinematic healing. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the story we once lived together had ended, and a new one, fragile, undefined, imperfect, might begin.
On the plane back to Portland, I stared out the window at a sky streaked with gold and thought, compassion is not returning to the fire. Compassion is rebuilding without burning. I didn't come back to restore what was broken. I came back to see what remained. And what remained was this. I could care. I could show up. I could witness without abandoning myself. Healing didn't make me cold. Healing made me whole. Returning to Portland felt different this time. Not like escape, not like exile, but like continuation, like stepping back into a life that was shaped by intention instead of inheritance. I unlocked my apartment, set my suitcase down, and stood there for a moment, letting the silence greet me. Not empty, not lonely, just mine. That first night back, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, staring out at the gentle rain tracing patterns down my window. I thought about the version of me who once would have returned from Austin shattered, angry, ashamed, triggered, seeking validation from people who didn't have the capacity to give it. But now I was grounded enough to see something clearly. Healing didn't make me indifferent to my family. It made me unwilling to sacrifice myself for their comfort. A few days later, I met Andre for dinner at a cozy restaurant downtown. Soft lighting, wooden tables, warm spices in the air. He walked in with that easy confidence, that steady calm that never felt performative. When he sat down, he searched my face, not for flaws or weakness, but for truth. "How was it?" he asked. I shrugged, tired but intact. "Complicated?" He smiled. "Good. Life is supposed to be." And I laughed, because the simplicity of that statement felt like wisdom. I told him pieces of what happened, my mother's trembling hands, Vivian's awkward attempts at remorse, Brandon's half-formed apology, my father's stoic refusal to acknowledge complexity. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't sanitize it. I just offered fragments. He didn't analyze or interrogate them. He just listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a gentle question. When I paused, unsure how to put the rest into words, he said, "You don't owe me the unpacked story. You don't owe anyone that." I exhaled, a tension I didn't realize I carried releasing from my shoulders. Healing wasn't just learning to speak. It was learning not to overshare as a performance of worth. The next morning, I woke up early and walked to the farmer's market. I bought peaches, fresh bread, flowers I couldn't name. I listened to strangers argue about local honey and watched children feed pigeons with reckless enthusiasm. Life was ordinary, and in its ordinariness, beautiful. I realized how deeply I had once believed that meaning required struggle, that joy had to be earned through endurance, that survival was a prerequisite for softness. Now I knew better. Joy could be casual, peace could be quiet, existence could be soft without being weak. Work accelerated. Leadership meant harder decisions, deeper stakes, broader responsibility. There were days when exhaustion crept in, days when imposter syndrome whispered old lies, days when I wondered if I was building something sustainable or simply performing competence. But every time I doubted, someone at work reaffirmed my value by trusting my judgment, asking for my insight, respecting my time. I wasn't being celebrated because I was exceptional. I was being respected because I was present. That distinction mattered. One weekend, Priya invited a group to hike a trail outside the city. I almost said no, not because I was busy, but because vulnerability often disguises itself as busyness. Avoidance masquerades as productivity. Instead, I said yes. The trail was steep and muddy, but the air was crisp, the trees towering, the world vast in a way that felt humbling. At the summit, wind whipping through our hair, bodies aching in satisfying ways, Priya grinned and said, "Sometimes you have to climb high to see how small the old world really was." I didn't respond. I just stood there, breathing in freedom. A few weeks later, my mother sent a letter. Paper, not email. Handwritten, not typed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't even apologetic in the way I once begged for. It was uncertain, clumsy, human. I don't know how to love you the way you needed. I don't know how to undo what I did. I don't know how to have a relationship with someone who doesn't need me. But I would like to try if trying doesn't cost you yourself. I sat with that letter for a long time, fingers tracing her shaky handwriting. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't interpret it as transformation. But I acknowledged the effort, the flawed, fumbling, unfinished effort. Healing didn't require me to open the door, but it allowed me to see when someone knocked differently. Around that same time, Andre and I shifted, not dramatically, not with declarations, but with quiet inevitability. We kissed one night after cooking dinner together, bare feet on kitchen tile, music playing softly, laughter paused mid-breath. It wasn't urgent or hungry or cinematic. It was steady, grounded, patient. A beginning, not a rescue. For the first time in my life, I wasn't entering love from scarcity. I wasn't begging to be seen. I wasn't performing worthiness. I was simply standing in the truth that I was whole before anyone chose me. Months passed, seasons changed, Portland rain gave way to rare summer sun. I started therapy less, not because I was fixed, but because I was integrating. I stopped counting victories. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped trying to script a future that looked impressive to anyone but me. One night, I sat on my balcony with Andre, legs touching, silence comfortable. I looked at the city lights, soft and distant, and thought about the girl who used to perform invisibility so others could glow. The girl who asked for crumbs and called them nourishment. The girl who waited for applause that would never come. She didn't disappear. She evolved. I wrote a single sentence in my journal that night. I didn't heal to become someone new. I healed to become someone real. Because authenticity isn't loud. It isn't glossy. It isn't triumphant. Authenticity is choosing yourself without apology. On my 33rd birthday, my friends gathered in my apartment, potluck style, laughter spilling across the room. Priya brought spicy noodles. Someone else brought a terrible homemade cake. Andre made a toast. Not dramatic, not poetic, just true. To Evelyn, who taught us that survival isn't the end goal. Joy is. I smiled, not modestly, not self-deprecatingly, but with full presence. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I felt like someone who built a life worth inhabiting.
Later that night, after everyone left, I stood in my kitchen, barefoot, quiet, content. I thought about Texas, not with bitterness, not with longing, but with closure. I didn't run away. I didn't abandon anyone. I didn't disappear. I simply refused to remain invisible in a story that erased me. I didn't choose a new life to spite anyone. I chose it because I finally understood I mattered. Without performance, without perfection, without permission. And if anyone ever asked who I became, the answer was simple. I became someone who chose herself. Not loudly, not angrily, but fully. And that was enough. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.